Good evening. I wanted to first thank everyone for joining Florida Cares and FAMM for Candidates, Constituents, and Conversations. It's our town hall event where we get to know the candidates and their stance on criminal justice and prison reform. My name is Amy McCourt, and I am the Legislative Director for Florida Cares. Tonight's town hall, we have Clint Barris, who is a candidate for House District 120, which covers Monroe County and parts of South Miami-Dade County. And we have with us constituents who live in District 120, which are Tanya Cleary, Stacy Washington, and Sam Marti. So what I want to start with is just kind of having Clint introduce himself and let us know, Clint, if you would, why you decided to get involved in politics, run for office, what your background is, a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So Clint Barris. I've lived in Key West now for 22 years. My wife and I moved down here from Tampa back in 1998. But I'm not born in Florida, but raised in Florida on a farm in Central Florida in Dade City. From a pretty poor family. There were times where we had to rely on food stamps to keep us from going hungry. I paid my way through college. I've been working since I was really young. And so I've earned my degree from Boston College, later from Georgetown University. I currently run a digital marketing agency down here in Key West, served on numerous boards, and I'm running. This is not something that has been on my radar for a long period of time. I'm running because there are certain times in your life when you need to stand up for what you believe in and carry the torch. And so that's what I feel that I'm doing now. I have no desire to be a politician. I want to be a public servant. I have two adolescent daughters who I care greatly for. And, for the last 22 years, our government, Florida government, has had a trifecta government, which is, one party controls the governorship and both chambers of the legislature. And so a lot of the democratic ideals and principles that I believe in haven't even really had an opportunity to be discussed, not to mention implemented. For the last 12 years or so, I've served on the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council, most recently as the chair. I recently termed out. The last meeting was my last meeting because I met term limits. But one thing that I've learned is that a lot of the problem with our environment down here in the Florida Keys and South Dade, Miami-Dade, is coming from the mainland of Florida. In the 1970s, our coral reef had over 40% coral cover. Now we're down to about 2%, and we're in a severe decline currently. So I'm running on several, there's a lot of bones I want to pick in Tallahassee. Certainly cleaning the water that's been killing Florida Bay and our reef for decades. I think that everybody should have healthcare. I think it's a human right. I don't understand why our government, Florida government, has for years denied billions in federal aid to expand our Medicaid program, which would include an additional 800,000 Floridians. My father passed away from colon cancer because he couldn't afford to go see a doctor. And when he did, it was already all over, And so it's situations like that that I don't believe that, the wealthiest nation in the country should have so much disparity between those that have and those that don't. And even here in the Florida Keys, there's a lot of wealth down here. Yet the United Way produces a document called the Alice Report, which really means that you have two people in the family working, a family of four, and the parents are barely able to make ends meet. So over I think it's 46% of all of Monroe County is either at Alice or the poverty level. And it's really unfortunate. Over like 70% of Monroe County school children are on free and reduced lunch. And all around us, there is much suffering, and it doesn't really get talked about at all. As I mentioned, when I was younger, we were poor. And I told myself then that if I was in a position to help others, that I would do so. And so I'm running now because I want to be the change, that Gandhi quote, be the change you want to see in the world. So, I'm not looking again for any sort of personal gain. If I serve one term, that's fine, because I'm not going to compromise my ideals, my values, and my truth. I want to be able to look my family in the eyes for the rest of my life and sleep well. So I want to fight for all Floridians, not just the wealthy corporations that fund campaigns, and really kind of make everybody's lives a little bit better. I think we could have a stronger Florida by investing in its people and its communities, and making Florida a place where people want to come and live. And knowing, especially now during the pandemic, I think that has really uncovered a lot of the inequity and inequality that we have in our system, which is good right now that at least there's a light shown on some of this that's been going on for decades. And I just want to be a public servant.
I appreciate that, all of it. Thank you. So what we're going to do now is, give your constituents the opportunity to just kind of ask you, some questions, and there's no secret about it. Florida Cares is a nonprofit who is centered on improving the lives of incarcerated individuals. We focus on advocacy through programs. We are heavily involved when we go to the lobby days, and our focus is, criminal justice and prison reform. So these questions will be centered, on those issues for you.
Okay.
All right. So just by way of, how my pictures are set up, I'll ask Tanya if you want to go ahead and ask Clint your question.
Hi, Clint. I was wondering, what is your position on prison reform, and specifically, how do you feel about mandatory minimums? What is your position there?
So I'm a huge advocate of prison reform. I think that our country, our state, we should use that time to really try to better the person with education, and not just book smarts, but also, mental education and well-being. Mandatory minimums, I think that I don't agree with that. I think every situation should be looked at and evaluated. America, embarrassingly, has it like 25% of the entire world's incarcerated population, and that's a black eye for our nation. It's a cause for embarrassment. We definitely have some issues that we need to address, and I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and look at those.
Thank you. We'll go next with Stacy. And don't forget to, there you go.
Yeah. Hi, how you doing today, Clint?
Excellent, thank you.
Good to talk for you, to hear from you. But do you believe it's possible to reduce Florida prisons population and to continue to reduce the crime rate at the same time?
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, going back to the the mandatory minimums, I believe that people oftentimes have met their the justice that needs to be served for them. And oftentimes people are left in prison for a very long time unnecessarily. It costs the taxpayers a great deal. It breaks up families and communities. Absolutely. And I know that there's some work in that direction right now, as far as, these mandatory sentences for, like nonviolent crimes and drug offenses. I'm absolutely willing to look at those for sure. Prison is, again, so many of our children have a parent in prison, and that is just devastating on a family. And I really think that we should be looking at each case holistically. What are all of the circumstances, not just on the crime itself, but on the person and the circumstances and what they've learned, and give them an opportunity.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. And before we get to our next question, I do see that we have another candidate that just joined in, Alexandria Suarez. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to give her, hi, Alexandria, how are you?
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you. Is that, yeah, is that how you want to remain on? Are you not in a situation to be on video?
No, I am. So coming back from work, for those of you that don't know, I work in Monroe County right now as assistant state attorney, but I still live in the Redland area in Homestead. So I'm actually just about to get home in 2 minutes, but I couldn't get online because I didn't have reception across the 18-mile stretch.
Okay.
So, yeah, but I'm here. I'm ready to answer questions, and I should be able to, park my car and tap on the video in probably 2 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Well, in the meantime, I'll give you the opportunity. At the beginning, I had asked Clint if he would, just kind of give us a little background on himself. What kind of pushed him into running for office. I hear, what you just said you did for a living. So that might be a little indication, but I'd like to definitely, share with, your constituents and those watching on Facebook Live, again, just kind of why you decided to run for office.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's the one thing that that Clint and I have in common is that both of us are political outsiders, and neither one of us have experience as career politicians or have attempted to run and not succeeded in the past. My position as assistant state attorney began earlier this year, but it's not the reason why I'm running for office. I actually have been a school teacher 10 years in Miami-Dade County. And from school teacher, I went into healthcare because I have 4 children who are now 20 to 31 years old. I simply couldn't afford to raise a family of 4 children on a teacher's paycheck. So that led me into healthcare. And I worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative. And just by coincidence, my territory was the district of the state house seat. So from farm to sea, I have been since 2005 working in the district, and that's something that none of the other candidates, Republican or Democrat, can say. I have just been from Miami-Dade to Key West. I did it for 8 years in healthcare. In my mid 40s, at 45, I had the opportunity to become a lawyer, get my law degree, and that's what I chose to do. And I was in private practice for 4 years until the Keys State Attorney's Office offered me a position, and I accepted it to just basically switch my day job. And I have been campaigning for almost a year now across the whole district. I haven't focused on one area over another because I believe from farm to sea, we need representation. And I'm the strongest candidate when it comes to healthcare and some of these issues. And you don't have to come from politics for that. I've lived it. I've experienced it along with everyone else in our district. So I understand what our issues are.
Great. Well, welcome. I'll do real quick introductions one more time for you. We have Tanya Cleary, who is a constituent from your district. We have Stacy Washington. She's also a constituent. Tanya is in the Monroe County area, and Stacy is in the South Dade area. And then we have Sam Marti, who is also, I believe, in the Miami-Dade area of the district.
South Dade area, yeah.
South Dade, right, okay.
We mentioned Redlands before, so.
Okay, all right. So I am going to, we have a Facebook question, and I'm going to read that off, and then I'll give you both the opportunity to, to answer that if that's okay. We have a question from Larry Benson. He would like to know, would you be in favor of criminalizing and prosecuting dishonest prosecutorial misconduct that leads to wrongful convictions and filling prison beds? Sorry. I'll go with you, Alexandria, if that's fine. And then Clint will let you answer.
Okay. Yeah, no, let me make sure you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a valid question. I think the issue, and we have bad actors in everything. I should preface with that. Whether it's in law, whether it's doctors, whether it is police officers, there's bad actors everywhere, but they're not the norm. and we shouldn't let the exceptions dictate the norm. Now, when it comes to the question was specifically for prosecutors or for people that are in law enforcement or in a position where they are going through the judicial process and they're affecting people's lives and rights, I believe that anyone that works outside the scope of what their role is should be accountable for whatever they're doing that's outside that scope. So in the sense of police officers, because that seems to be the hot topic with everything that's been going on, you have a police officer that has excessive force on a defendant. It's a case by case basis. We've got to take a look at that. I mean, if it's clearly egregious and it's clearly outside the scope of it, then there can be repercussions. But we have mechanisms in place for that right now. I mean, you have internal affairs. You have certain measures that are taken when someone exceeds that scope of their role, their job. And the problem is, police officers, law enforcement, they have a tough job. And there are times where they are in a situation where they may have to use that force. Well, we can't have police officers worrying about whether or not they're going to be on the hook personally for having to, apprehend the defendant or, defendant that's resisting arrest, and have to worry about being prosecuted for trying to do their job. So it's a loaded question in the sense that you have to look at it case by case. So depending on the facts, depending on the situation, and depending on what happened, it may be one response versus another. It may be a situation where, okay, no, why would that law enforcement officer have to be put through, be charged with what they did, versus another situation where it's clear that law enforcement officer was not working within his capacity, and then they have measures in place. And as we've seen in other instances, they're charged. They are charged and they have to go through the process. But we have a judicial process that takes that into account.
Thank you. And we'll go now to Clint. Same questions. You want me to read it back again, or are you solid on it?
I think I'm pretty solid. It's about prosecutor, like basically somebody who's a prosecutor who is bending the rules to try to get somebody in jail. And I would agree with Alexandria and most of what she said, that there are already laws and processes for that. In fact, this is in the last year, right here in Monroe County, we had a prosecutor lose her license for a year. She can't practice for a year because she was withholding evidence. And so, nobody is above the law. Not the president or anybody else in our nation is above the law. So everybody should be held to account. And I'm a firm believer in integrity, which is basically doing the right thing when nobody's looking. We should all live in accordance with the beliefs in the system that we would want ourselves to be, governed and judged by.
Okay, thank you. I will now, we have another Facebook question, but I'm gonna let Sam in here. Sorry about that, Sam. And ask him to go ahead and, pose his question, and then we'll start with Clint, and then we can go to Alexandria.
Sure. So for Mr. Clint, thank you so much. I noticed you filled out the Florida Cares questionnaire. And just based off of your answers to the questionnaire, I want to ask if you'll commit to co-sponsoring any of the proposed reforms in the questionnaire, which you indicated your support. Just for example, will you co-sponsor a bill supporting climate control in Florida state prisons? We live in the southernmost part of Florida, so we know how hot it gets, but our Florida state-run prisons don't have air conditioning for our loved ones inside.
Yes, absolutely. And part of our system is also not unusual or cruel punishment. And you're right, it gets incredibly hot and humid down here in Florida. And I don't think that a part of the sentence is to live in a situation that you might end up with heat stroke. So yeah, I don't think that that should be part of putting somebody in unbearably hot situations is really part of the goal of what reform is about.
Thank you. Alexandria?
I think I think everybody would agree on that response. I don't think anybody wants unusual and cruel punishment for people that are imprisoned or in jail. But I would have to ask specifically where in South Florida that's taking place. So my fiance is a family medicine physician, and he used to visit the detention center and the prison that's down south by Everglades National Park. I don't recall that was an issue there. If it's an issue in Monroe County, I'm sure that that's something that they would be taking care of. So I'm curious as to where is it that happened?
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just want to clarify. The question was whether or not you both will commit to co-sponsoring any of the proposed reforms in the Justice Voter Questionnaire, which Mr. Clint answered, and I know Ms. Suarez, your answers aren't uploaded on the website, so I have no idea whether or not you answered. And again, it is in Florida state-run prisons, so there might be some facilities located in our district or our county, but there are multiple ones in Central Florida and North Florida that are state-run prisons without air conditioning.
Okay, I'd have to look into that. I don't see why we wouldn't have air conditioning in any of these facilities. I don't think that's part of the punishment.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify a little bit further. And we're not talking about, county jails. We are talking about specifically state-run prisons, and there are a handful throughout the state that might have air conditioning. The private, there's a few private facilities. They have air conditioning. There are a few of the state-run facilities that have air conditioning in some of the dorms, but the majority of the prisons in the state of Florida do not have air conditioning because the majority of the buildings that they're using for prisons right now are too old. They've shut down many of the newer built prisons and kept the older ones, which are, the bulk of the prisons in the state of Florida are, up towards the Panhandle. And those buildings have been around since the 1940s. And so, not to mention the lack of proper ventilation and exhaust. There's no windows to crank open. There's grated, there's little grates that are about the size of a shoebox that get filled with dust and mold. So there's not even any cross breeze. You'll have 20-foot high ceilings, and you'll have a ceiling fan like the one you see running in Tanya's house or Denise's house up attached to the 20-foot ceiling. So that's definitely a major concern with the heat that we suffer in Florida. So we encourage our candidates or our legislators in the state of Florida to visit a prison and to visit, a state-run prison. And so if either, one of the two of you are to be elected, we would ask you to visit unannounced because you have that right. The only people that do have that right are legislators, judges, and attorneys who have, clients within. So show up unannounced and ask for a tour and know where you're going ahead of time, because likelihood might be they might take you to the one dorm out of 10 that does have air conditioning because it's the elderly dorm or the medical dorm or something like that. I do have a couple more Facebook questions. Heather Lynn would like to know, would you support legislation that would reform mandatory minimums for what is considered violent offenses? And Alexandria, I'll give you the opportunity to start here with that.
Thank you. So I do support mandatory minimums for violent crimes because that's part of the deterrent. that's part of the process in deterring soft criminals from becoming hard criminals. And there are, and I see this even now that I'm within the criminal justice system working. There are our criminal justice system is more fair than people that aren't involved in it would believe, because there's plenty of diversion programs. There's plenty of instances where if there's no criminal history, or there's one instance where something occurred, but there's no conviction on the record, they could have been arrested but not convicted. Well, then guess what? The criminal rules of the rules of criminal procedure say that that defendant can go into diversion or probation or some other less restrictive means of their liberties. They're not necessarily just all thrown into jail or prison for that matter. And unfortunately, some people just don't learn the lesson or don't appreciate the second chance that they receive, or the third chance or the fourth chance in some instances. So I have a better understanding now of why those minimum mandatory sentences are in place compared to when I was in the private sector. So I see the need for it in certain instances, such as with violent crimes. What that reform would look like, I would have to see, because if it's a matter of someone being imprisoned for an extensive amount of time, well, we have to look at that situation, that case, and figure out whether or not they can be released, because that's the other thing. Even when they're imprisoned, well, you know, minimum mandatories for certain things, that the whole point of it is to make sure that people don't commit the crime. If it's a crime against a child, or it's a murder, or it's something that's just so heinous, we consider so heinous in society, that is supposed to be the deterrent. Otherwise, our crime rates can go up. So I'm not against minimum mandatory sentences, but I would certainly need to take a look at where the reform is specifically wanted, the reasons behind it, because I do believe that it's a strong deterrent. And coming now from the criminal justice system, I can tell you there are many opportunities where defendants that are first offenders, second offenders, or haven't been convicted of the same crimes are able to have another opportunity at doing what they're supposed to do in society.
Thanks. Clint, same question, if you would.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Again, I think a lot of the problems that we have in our nation is mandatory minimums. In fact, if you look at charts of our nation's incarceration rates, it's really like in the 1980s when they did the 3 strikes and you're out, and the curve of our incarcerations is exploding. I want to be very clear though, I am not saying that we need to be soft on crime or on punishment, but I'm saying that every situation needs to be looked at in the totality of that situation. There are certain crimes that have high recidivism rates, and there are others that do not. So I think when you force a minimum sentence, that you're taking the judge's ability to reason and to consider all of the facts of the case into consideration when imposing that sentence. So I think that it would be more fair and more just to really allow the judge to have parameters. So a certain crime should have a sentence of a certain caliber, and then to be able to sentence based on all the surrounding facts.
Thank you. All right, let's see. We have the next question from Vicky Carl. Would you support going to 65% gain time for incarcerated individuals? And we can start with Alexandria.
Can you repeat that question?
Yes. Would you support going to 65% gain time for incarcerated individuals?
I don't I think our criminal justice system has, and because I'm coming from that arena now, I see that it's more fair than what the average person believes. And that has to be a case by case basis. I would not automatically be for it. I would not automatically be against it, but there are mechanisms in place in our criminal justice system for mitigating factors, for reduction of time. Yeah, I see it all the time. Every day we have plenty of instances where, and even with the mandatory minimums, the mandatory minimums are in some situations are not automatic the first go around. There are instances in certain crimes where mandatory minimums kick in when there's priors involved. So, but I didn't realize that until I became a prosecutor. And it is a relief because obviously I'm for fairness. And if someone makes a mistake, we shouldn't ruin their life because of it. We should allow an opportunity for them to come back into society, become productive citizens of society again, be able to, become a teacher or be a business owner, whatever the case may be, what they want to do, and do things the way they're supposed to. But I that black and white, there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of gray in there. And our system does have a lot of that gray factored in.
You believe they can be improved if not? Why?
Would you like me to answer that now?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Sure. So we have that now, right? But it just goes to 85%. And so the question is, would we want to extend that gain time to 65% from 85%? And so again, if somebody is in prison, and depending on their actions and behavior in prison is how they gain additional time off their sentence. So really, I think the question is, would I agree to moving it from 85% of sentence served down to 65%?
Right.
Added surface, that sounds fair. But again, every situation needs to be looked at. So the people that are working with that inmate at the time, who know his or her character and can attest to that. Also too, upon release, I think that there needs to be, some close supervision to make sure that our state has not erred. But, I do believe, some of these sentences are incredibly long. And to spend one's life, 15 years in prison for a non-violent crime, where you've shown, to be of good character, and reformed yourself and educated yourself while you're in there and atoned for your crimes, then yeah, I think that there should be some leeway for situations like that.
I don't see where that happens with non-violent crimes.
I have a loved one that's serving a 20-year mandatory minimum for a nonviolent crime. And it was basically his first offense. So, it does happen. You may not see that. I think a lot of times what you're talking about, yes, people get in the system, and if they are, if they want to take a diversion program or they want to take a plea, that works out much better for them. But what happens if a person wants to take it to trial, they suddenly throw every kind of charge against them with mandatory minimums, and they don't even realize, I think most people don't even realize until they're in that situation, that they could end up serving 20 years because they exercised their right to a trial, which every American should be allowed to do to prove their innocence. Right now, we're kind of set up to take a plea, or you're looking at really hard time.
Yeah, well, I just for the record, I agree with you in that I don't think they should be throwing the book at someone, so to speak, because they choose to go to trial. The fundamental liberty that has made this country so great is due process. And coming from the private sector, I used to practice in administrative law, and I learned that there's an entire parallel court system when it's related to agencies. And while it's not criminal type of offense, you have your due process is just out the window. It's out the window. And so it's unfortunate, but I think that just based on what you're expressing and what you're telling me about your loved one, I think that goes towards, the prosecutor. I think the issue there is, who was handling it, because, and that's one of the reasons, quite frankly, why I even considered, becoming a prosecutor, coming from the defense side, because I used to defend fraud claims. And while it was in healthcare, I think it's a good opportunity to have prosecutors that will follow the letter of the law and that will be fair, and where you have someone that's a first offense offender, and there's a diversion program available for them, they should be afforded that opportunity. Now, the flip side of that is when you're looking at a case where a defendant over and over and over again, 10 times, 12 times, continues to be arrested for the same crimes, or sometimes it's worse. Sometimes you see it escalating, and everything has been just dropped or abandoned, or diversion program. At some point, somebody needs to say, you know what, enough is enough, because you're endangering the public. So it's certainly a balancing act, and I do think that we need more fair prosecutors.
Thank you. So it looks like, and I know we're a little past the time, I hope you're both okay with that, but we'll wrap up in just a second. Is that okay with both of you?
Sure.
You're okay. So we have a question/comment from Garofina. She says, what happens to those who have life sentences for non-homicide first-time offenders, innocent and wrongfully convicted? What remedy do they have? All laws need to be made retroactive. A second look for all, including violent offenders, is necessary to reduce prison population. Parole and commutation of sentence should exist like it does in other states. Florida state needs to step up and do more and revamp the criminal system. More new laws are needed. So I guess the first part of that was her question. What happens to those who have a life sentence for non-homicide, first-time offenders, and those who are innocent and wrongfully convicted? Clint, I guess we can start with you.
Sure. And for the longest time, for most of my life until just recently, I believed in the death penalty, but there are innocent people that are put to death, and spending your life in prison is a worse punishment than, in some people's eyes, and in my regard, like I think spending the rest of my human life in prison would be worse than a death penalty. Yeah, it's unfortunate that there are innocent people that are caught up in our system, and there should be a mechanism, and there is, to have your case reviewed. I just think really looking at it subjectively, how America has 4% of the population and 25% of the world's prison population, just at the surface, it is clear we have problems that need to be addressed. So, and that comes in several different forms, from the mandatory minimums. I don't know about this specific question of how that person was convicted and they're innocent, and that's horrible. And, we hear about cases like that all the time. And I hope that they can find justice and relief.
Thank you. Alexandria?
Thank you. So thinking on the line of questioning that we're having, the criminal justice system is clearly not a place where we should have cookie cutter sentencing or methods. Things have to be case by case basis. When it comes to reform of our criminal justice system, and Clint's talking about the high percentage we have of people that are imprisoned, and it simplifies a very, very complicated issue. And so we can't answer the problem with the same problem at the other end. So as a conservative, I believe that, we need to, personal liberties and personal freedoms are number one, when it comes to the criminal justice system, minimum mandatory sentences, if they need reform, well, the answer is not to eliminate them altogether either. So everything has to have a balance, because otherwise you're just going to swing from one end of the pendulum to the other. And that's just going to give us a whole set of different problems. So I think it's something that the legislators should take a look at, certainly, and see what needs to be done. I don't know, and I apologize if I missed the question, but I'll give a perfect example is convicted felons being able to vote again, to restore their voting rights without paying the fines or paying the fees or the costs. Well, that is something that they struck this is their deal. This is what they agreed to, and these are the fines, and this is what was accepted. And if that is part of the package that you agreed to, then you should complete your sentence, regardless of whether or not it includes fines. To come after the fact and say, well, no, I don't want to pay those fines, or I'm not going to be responsible for that, but I want my voting rights restored. Well, one of the deterrents of not committing serious crimes is you lose your right to vote, besides losing your right to, have a firearm, but you lose your right to vote. And that is supposed to serve as a deterrent. If you want it restored, and we're having mechanisms in place, and there's reform that says, yes, a convicted felon can have their rights restored, hallelujah. But you need to complete your end of the bargain. Don't come afterwards and try to change the terms, because that maybe would have changed what the sentencing was or what the plea offer was. So, and I'm being, I can be who I am. I'm being transparent. I've got a lot to offer to the district. And while I'm a conservative and I'm Republican, I am very, very firm on due process and on rights of individuals, and what happens when you lose those rights. And everything is a case-by-case basis. We can't cookie cutter one end or the other. We can't go to the left or to the right, because we end up with a whole new set of problems. So I appreciate the questions, and I hope my responses and Clint's responses give an indication to people where we stand. But we really need, at the end of the day, is we need legislators that have experience in these areas. I mean, if you're going to ask me questions on architecture, you're going to ask me questions on engineering, or what type of, oh, it's getting dark. I'm sorry, just realized that. I'm still sitting in my car. I apologize. If you were to ask me questions on engineering, I can't answer it. Maybe we need something for engineering for, more hurricane-proof homes. But, to ask candidates about criminal reform, and I appreciate, Clint saying this is what I stand for, but it's really tough for people to get a really good gauge unless that candidate has experience in that area, within that area. We can certainly get educated. I like the idea of going to visit the prisons. I would certainly go visit the prisons and see it for myself. But I want to be clear on why I'm reluctant with answering some of these questions, and how it's just not black and white. Because there are instances where what's good for one person isn't good for the other. And so we have to just take it case by case. And we're a nation of laws, and we're a state of laws. And if our laws are in place and this is the law, we need to abide by it until, we can make the changes that need to be made. We can't ignore those laws.
Thank you. And I know I said that was the last question, but I'm being told that there's two constituents on here, Maisha and Sam, that still have questions. May we hear their questions for you too?
As long as they don't mind that I'm kind of in the dark in the car.
Me too. I'm just realizing, and I've got my light on, so we'll work with it. Maisha, you have a question? And don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you so much. So my question is, do you believe or feel that the current Florida state drug laws need to be revamped, revised? If so, why? If not, why not? And if you think that they should, can you please elaborate on how you would like to see that done. Thank you.
Clint?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, drug laws, I'm sorry, Maisha, what was the first part?
The first part was, do you feel that the current, uh-oh, did you lose me?
No, I got you.
Nope, you're here.
Yeah, I do. So for instance, marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug, right up there with heroin. You know, that is just ridiculous in my opinion. Yes, we do need to take a broader look of our laws and our sentencing, and victimless crimes need, you know, as Alexandria said, everything needs to be taken individually, not blanket statements. I believe that judges should be able to have a sentencing guideline, but not have to enforce a mandatory minimum for a certain crime. And let me just go back to a little bit and address something that Alexandria said a moment ago about restoring felons' voting rights. That was a clear directive from Florida voters that we wanted our felons that have served their time to be able to vote again. And then our Republican legislature basically imposed this poll tax for another term just to limit, you know, their ability to vote. Nobody said that they were off the hook from paying their restitution and the monetary fines that were imposed upon them. But the voters were very clear in the intent of that amendment, and Republicans usurped our voice. So that's really unfortunate. And I would like to readdress that as well.
Thank you. Alexandria?
I think we can agree to disagree, because when voters, and I voted for it, that whatever, and that includes fine and court costs, or whatever each individual defendant has to pay to have their rights restored. But you know, we can agree to disagree. Coming from healthcare, the healthcare sector, what I witnessed personally, being 8 years in healthcare as a political representative, and then when I became a lawyer in my 40s, I actually practiced in healthcare, also compliance, regulatory affairs, and it was provider defense. So I was defending in fraud claims and in Medicare overpayments and Medicare audits. And what I witnessed was, with the opioid crisis, and you know, maybe she's taught the constituent clarify if it's medical marijuana, or any other drugs, but I can speak to what I know from the opioid crisis. We had a government that years ago decided to tell physicians that if patients come in and they have pain, then physicians have a Hippocratic oath to prescribe pain medication for those patients. And of course, we know what happened with that. A lot of the pharmaceutical companies had opioids, and you know, a lot of promotion and pushing the opioids, which were addictive. And then we had people that were addicted to these opioids. And what the law decided to do, what our lawmakers decided to do, is swing the pendulum all the way to the other end, and decided nobody's going to prescribe opioids anymore because there's a crisis. Well, people who truly needed those opioids, truly needed, that there could have been no other way, but they're at the point they went out to the street and they ended up on heroin and ended up dying of overdoses of other medications or other drugs because they could not get the opioid. Physicians are in the best position to wean patients off of an addiction if that was the situation. But lawmakers instead went and swung the other way, the opposite direction, and tied physicians' hands, and even pain management physicians who are being criminalized because they prescribe 120 pills in a month. Well, if you do the math and you're taking a pain medication, which you have to take 3 or 4 times a day, it's going to 90 to 120 pills a day. I don't think those physicians are over prescribing. It's the nature of that medication and how it's prescribed. But going to that point, I think lawmakers have their hands too much in too many pots and too many locations that they shouldn't be in, and healthcare is one of them. So we shouldn't be everything. People have a choice. Public safety
a role in that because we don't want people driving that are under any influence, whether it's alcohol or marijuana, because it impairs their faculties. And what we need are legislators that understand how to read the clinical studies and know which clinical study is peer reviewed and credible versus which one isn't, because that will help address those issues. And if there's a certain type of drug, like marijuana, that voters decide that they want to decriminalize, okay, then they can regulate it if that's what they choose to do, regulate it, and can get that off, out of our court system and out of our jails. Somebody who's picked up for marijuana, less than 20 grams, is serving the same time as a rapist. In my opinion, I think they're two completely different crimes, and we need to balance the scales. But I think the underlying issue we have is not, can we add laws? Can we add laws for this? And can we add laws for that? Why aren't we going back and looking at the laws we already have on the books? And let's take a look at what worked, what hasn't worked. Let's get rid of it, or let's amend it and let's fix it. But all these laws and laws, all that as a citizen, and hopefully people will agree with me, is that means more of our rights, more process, and making things very different from what our founding fathers intended when they wrote that Constitution for us.
Does that mean that you stand in favor of retroactivity with the changing of the laws? When you talk about going back to the ones that have already been made, like working with what we've got, are you in favor of making the changes retroactive?
It depends what it is. For certain laws, I think retroactivity would certainly help, but not with everything. I'd have to take a look at specific, what law are we looking at, and go from there. That's why I don't like to give the blanket, yes or no answers. And I'm certainly not one that panders to anybody's votes, even on the Republican side with a primary. But I can tell you that it has to be case by case, or it has to be a little more specific. And I know we don't have, time over a Zoom interview or, candidate forum to go over all of it. But I can tell you that from my perspective, I'm willing to put in the time to review the books. And coming from being trained and being a lawyer and serving as a prosecutor, I certainly have more of those skills compared to the other candidates.
Thank you. And so Alexandria, just on that note, and I know we do have, I believe, one more question from Sam, but I do want to say on that note, we would like a commitment from you tonight, if you can, to fill out the questionnaire. We sent it out to all 387 candidates in the House and Senate races in Florida. I don't show that we have your response yet. And in that questionnaire, there are actual links to bill proposals. So that it would give you the opportunity to review. A lot of it is kind of involving revamping what currently exists, what's broken. There are definitely, some new proposals as well, but we would definitely love, again, to get your commitment. We have our website, Florida FL Justice Voter, where again, all 387 candidates between the Senate and the House for the primaries, the ones who have posted their answers and the ones who have not, we would like your constituents to be able to go there and, kind of read your position on these. There's 12 bills that we are mostly interested in as, a criminal justice and prison reform advocacy group, and our members, and again, your constituents. So if you don't have, the email, we can definitely resend it to you. I know, there's a lot of maybe getting caught up in spam right now with a campaign going on. So we can definitely resend it to you at whichever email address, you prefer. And again, we'd love to see your thoughts on those 12 pieces of proposed legislation.
Yeah, I'll definitely take a look at it. I'm not sure if it went out, if it didn't go out, if the outbox, it was a lot of candidates.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And Sam, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question, and I just want to, before my question, thank you so much to both of Ms. Flores and Mr. Barras for coming out today. I know we invited other candidates out to this and they didn't show up. So thank you so much for being here and actually being reachable and talking to your constituents. Really quickly, I just want to emphasize again that I voted for Amendment 4, and in the language of Amendment 4, it didn't talk about anything with repaying any restitutions for your fines. And as a voter, I wasn't thinking about fines at all. I know we talked about that, and I think it was Flores who mentioned that people should have to vote for the payments for the felonies they committed. But again, that wasn't what I voted for, so I don't know where that came from. But really quickly, to both of you, the nonprofit, the Florida Sheriff's Association, their annual budget comes from Florida taxpayer money. About a third of the Florida Sheriff's Association annual budget comes from our tax money. And over the last year or so, that nonprofit, the Florida Sheriff's Association, spent about $200,000 on contract lobbyists. Do you believe, both of you, do you believe that voters, not just in your district, because it's everyone in the state of Florida, should be taxed to subsidize the Florida Sheriff's Association's lobbying efforts?
We can start with Alexandria.
I do not believe that it should be on tax dollars. I think we've got a lot of work to do across the board in cutting things out that are paid by tax dollars, because the government should not be in the business of a lot of areas that it unfortunately happens to be in the business of lately. So I have pledged to look at what we can to cut fat, and if that's something that's paid by taxpayers, then I'm more than willing to take a look at it and see, because I don't believe that tax dollars should be going to anything other than what is the primary function of our government.
Thanks. Clint?
Yeah, I would need to look at that a little more closely also. I mean, obviously, I realize that our state does support a lot of nonprofits across our state. Sam, unfortunately, I don't really know what the Sheriff's Association is about, other than just advocating for sheriffs in general. I don't believe that that should be taxpayer funded, though. I would agree with Alexandria on that. There's a lot of need in our community, and I would hope that our tax dollars would go to something other than lobbyists.
All right. I want to thank both of you and all of you great constituents for joining us tonight. I know we went way over the time that we thought it would take, but I'm so glad that you all had the time to share with us. And again, Alexandria, I encourage you to fill out our questionnaire. And again, I'll send you, we can connect offline, and I can send you the link directly if you want.
All right. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. And thank you to the constituents, because I think the biggest part of this is having informed voters. We really lose a lot if we don't have informed voters.
Agreed. And that's we're trying to get as many of these in, in the areas that are having primaries. And then we'll be doing more, before the generals. So again, just thank you so much for your time and for sharing your stance with us. And you guys have a good night.
Very much. Thanks for having us.
Bye.